All right, friends, you know that the Met Opera is where you can come to hear legends. And thanks to Met Education, it's not just legendary singers. Our first speaker today is a true luminary in the field of Shakespeare studies. Dr. Dympna Callaghan is the William L. Safire Professor of Modern Letters at Syracuse University. And when we get into our tongue twister activity later today, try saying that 5 times fast. Among her numerous publications, I particularly recommend that you and your students check out her book, Hamlet, Language and Writing from the Ardent Shakespeare. And tune back in at the end of May when she joins us for book club. More on book club in just a moment. But for now, let's give a warm Met Education welcome all the way through Zoom to Dr. Dympna Callaghan.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. And in the interests of everything, my pronouns are she, her. I've got long brownie colored hair. I'm a kind of middle-aged lady and a pink sweater. And I'm speaking to you today from Onondaga Nation territory here in Syracuse. So there's so much to say about Hamlet, and I can't say all of it. So I'm just going to try and give you a sense of the play, of where it comes from. And let me see if I can show my, start my slideshow. Let's see if I can get this to do its thing. Is this appearing the way it should?
I think you might want to hit play from start over on the that left-hand icon.
Oh, jolly good. Thank you very much. People at the Met know everything, which is great. So I'll particularly be thinking about the relationship between Hamlet and femininity. I won't so much talk about Ophelia, although the mad woman aspect would fit very well also with your next opera. But I will try and talk a little bit about femininity, and I'll go through some of the passages of the play to give you a sense of why, what really makes Hamlet Hamlet is the language. And this has been a difficulty, obviously, for many composers. In 2017, just before Brett Dean and Matthew Jocelyn's Hamlet premiered at Glyndebourne, the Guardian newspaper said there have been 40 operas based on Hamlet written since 1812. How many of them can you name exactly? And the rest of the article went on to say, but this is the one, this is the one, the Brett Dean and Matthew Jocelyn is the one that you will absolutely know after this. So there was, Verdi tried to do it, several other great composers, but there is always the difficulty that you've got to crunch the play, although many modern theatrical productions really do crunch the play. And even that expression is a little bit problematic because there are 3 versions of Hamlet that we know of. It's not just one text. And you don't want Shakespeare's language to overwhelm the music, obviously, and the singing. But Ambroise Thomas's 1868 production, probably the most famous. It was revived by the Met in 2010. So that's probably the one prior to this one that most comes to mind for most people. But these 3 versions of Hamlet are a problem for any production of Hamlet, whether on stage, screen, or indeed in the theatre. The first version of Hamlet was printed in 1603, and it bears very little resemblance to anything Shakespeare ever wrote. We think it's what's known as a memorial construction. That is a bunch of actors who had been, perhaps seen the play. It's this kind of pirated version. The characters' names are different in many instances. And the most egregious and famous distinction between the 1603 first quarto, often known as the bad quarto of Hamlet, and the other ones, is that the great line, to be or not to be, that is the question. That wonderful, even iambic line is rendered as to be or not to be. Aye, there's the point. Although it works quite well in the theatre. I have seen it performed in the upstairs of a pub, and it was great. And there's the point, had the actor putting the dagger toward his breast. So it made, it kind of made sense from that point of view. And the other key thing from the point of view of the theme that I'll be addressing today is that only in this text, 1603 Q1, does Gertrude actually tell us what she knew and when she knew it. In the other versions of the play, the one in 1604, which is the one from which most of your editions of the play will be taken, which is known as the second quarto, Q2, we don't know that, nor do we know from the folio version of the play in 1623. But we think that 1602 is sort of the most accurate, but there's some bits that are really important in the folio. And it may just be that Shakespeare had a different understanding, that early modern people had a different understanding about the relationship between performance and print and didn't feel so kind of wedded to it. But there are many Hamlet mysteries that we do not know, and that's kind of one of them. So I hope this isn't too small for you to read. You can always, raise it on the screen later. But I thought we'd talk about the first soliloquy, which is really about melancholy. It's not the to be or not to be, the famous, the most iconic suicide speech, which is in Act 3, Scene 1. Obviously, act and scene numbers, especially scene numbers, change a bit depending on the edition of the play that you're using. But these quotations are mainly taken from the Folger digital text, which is online, which is very, very handy. So there is some thought about self-disillusion, the dissolution of the self, which I think is really interesting, but it's not quite that kind of theme. Now, why would Shakespeare have been thinking about this? Well, his father dies shortly after we think he composed Hamlet, and our best guess for the date is 1600, so right on the cusp of the turn of the century. In 1596, his own son Hamlet had died, and he was a twin, the twin of Judith, who in fact survived her father. So that's a possibility. But then there are also texts that Shakespeare was using, source texts. There is Amleth from the History of Denmark by Saxo Grammaticus, which was published first in 1514. And in fact, there's a new movie called The Northman, which is based on the this saga rather than on Shakespeare's text specifically. So that's something to watch out for. So it's very much a Hamlet moment. So there is that, and that's about two brothers, Feng and Horwendy, who are in the same situation as Claudius and the old King Hamlet's father in Shakespeare's own play. There's also a German play called Bestrafte die Brudermord, which we also think Shakespeare might have known, but we're not sure. But certainly he had encountered Francois de Belforet's account of the Hamlet story, which Belforet took primarily from Saxo Grammaticus. So, there are various themes, but still, his son was called Hamlet, and apparently Hamlet and Hamlet were names that were virtually interchangeable in this period. Now, the other little kind of link, how Shakespeare's mind works, we can never quite tell, but it is nonetheless really compelling that he is writing a play with a name, his title character is so like the name of his own son, who died. He was only 11 when he died. But also, when Shakespeare was a boy of 15, in 1579, a young woman called Catherine Hamlet, double T at the end of the name, but in fact, in early modern spelling, names often have letters missing or added, but she's called Catherine Hamlet, and she apparently slips into the River Avon and drowns while she was trying to fill a pail of water, or so the autopsy reported. But her death was reported as her death was doubtful. It wasn't clear that that it was an accident or whether it was suicide. And that would have been important. Sometimes pregnant women, unmarried pregnant women who were very desperate might take their own life. But it was recorded as a doubtful death, uncertain, but probably an accident. And when we think about that in relation to Ophelia, that's really kind of a remarkable coincidence. So this is Shakespeare writing this play that's got these resonances. That he's read the books, no doubt. He's certainly got source material, but also there are these connections with his own life, which I think is really interesting. Now, this soliloquy, which I'll try and whip through at some speed, is fascinating to me because this is before he sees the ghost. It's poised between his encounter with the court, where he's told by both Claudius, his stepfather, he's now stepfather, and his mother Gertrude, that he should not be still mourning his father, the death of his father. And at that point, we don't know how long his father has been dead, and he doesn't say very much in that in that episode. So this is his first soliloquy, and he tells us it's the first time we have the sense of his interior thoughts, and it's crucial that it is before the revelation of the ghost. And I think people often forget that when we think about Hamlet's 8 soliloquies, that there's actually, this is a really significant, oh, that this too sullied flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his canon against self-slaughter. So this is a sort of generalized proposition. In the folio text, it's sullied flesh, assailed flesh. Sullied implies sinful flesh, as in the Christian notion of the original sin of human beings. And then this thawing, melting, and resolving itself into a dew is also probably related to Ovid's Metamorphoses, which was Shakespeare's favorite book of poetry. And it had been translated by Arthur Golding in 1567. And then this is a sort of general, proposition, or that the everlasting had not fixed his canon against self-slaughter. So not as specific as to be or not to be, like the immediate decision of suicide, but he's melancholic to the point of great despair, early contemplation of self-slaughter at this point. Oh God, God, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. Fiant are fie, 'tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely. So instead of the Garden of Eden that we see in the book of Genesis, that all early moderns knew about because they, church going was compulsory. So you would hear the scripture in church. This is a world that is corrupt, an unweeded garden, a kind of uncontrolled proliferation of horrible things that stink. And those words grows to seed, something that's burgeoning, in an uncontrolled and kind of terrifying way. Seed, rank, and gross kind of link us to some of the sexual things that Hamlet is going to say a little bit later on in the speech. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely, that it should come to this, but 2 months dead. Well, this is the first time we've heard about how long this has happened. Nay, not so much, not 2. Oh, it's a bit shorter than 2 months, really. We're not sure about the time frame here. There's a sense of, we get throughout the play actually, a sense of temporal distortion, because, Hamlet at one point, university student, a bit later, seems to be 30 years old, by the graveyard scene. So excellent a king was to this, Hyperion to a satyr. So Hyperion is his father, who is the sun god. This is the satyr. Let me, here's Hyperion on the right. And this is Claudius. Now, it took me a while to find a good image of this, because I have to tell you, most satyrs, the American pronunciation is satyrs, but I want to say satyr because that's how we say it in England. Never mind. Most of them are kind of obscene. If you're using these in teaching, you have to be a bit careful, because on the side of Greek vase paintings, there is a very priapic figure, usually representing the satyr, who is half man, half goat. And the goat represents this kind of hypersexual energy, indiscriminate sexual energy as well. So, you know, the god and the oversexed goat-like figure of Claudius were told. And Hamlet's going to compare these figures with his mother again in the closet scene, when he says, look upon this picture and on this. And, you know, sometimes the audience can see the two images or not. And again, you know, we the audience have to kind of make our minds up about the distinction between these two. Oh, I don't know why that keeps whipping along there. Apologies. So, so loving to my mother. This is the one who's like Hyperion, his father, that he might not beteem the winds of heaven, visit her face too roughly. So this is the protective energy of the husband. You know, this is protecting against, you know, what the sonnet's called, that, you know, the wind, rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. This is a protective kind of energy. Not really a very sexy guy, though, I have to say, coming across here. Unlike what we're going to hear about the satyr, who's clearly described in terms of sexual energy. Must I remember? Big theme of the play, remembrance. Why is it so important? A, because his father's just died, and because his father is apparently in purgatory. Purgatory is a place that is prescribed by the Protestant Reformation. It's a Catholic location for the dead who have not yet ascended to heavenly bliss because of sins they have committed while they were alive. So, and heaven and earth, this is where we're going to be suspended between heaven and earth in purgatory. The ghost is very clear, he's from purgatory. And also when he tells Hamlet, when the ghost tells Hamlet to revenge, he says, he doesn't simply say, he says you must revenge his most foul and unnatural murder, but he says, remember me. And remember me is one of the words of the Catholic Mass too. Do this in memory of me. So, and when you're avenging, you have to keep in mind the original injury, or you'll lose the oomph to actually go ahead and do the deed. So, huge theme. I'm doing what I naughtily do when I teach, which is take too long over a passage. I'll try and speed up here. And my mother appeared. She appeared to be the one with the sexual appetite. Remember that the Hyperion figure is not the one who in this marriage to his father that was the most sexual one. And that comports with early modern ideas that women were kind of oversexed and men were more contained and controlled themselves. Oops, it keeps doing that, beg your pardon. She would hang on him as if increase of appetite had grown by what it fed on. And yet within a month, let me not think on, again, memory, what I'm trying to repress, frailty, thy name is woman. A month. So we've gone from 2 months, less than 2 months, to a month. A little month, or ere those shoes were old. She had new shoes on at the funeral, apparently, with which she followed my poor father's body, like Niobe, all tears. Niobe was punished by the gods with the death of her 9 children who had to remain unburied, and she wept so much that she was turned into a weeping stone. So she's both petrified, petrifaction, becoming a stone, and she's weeping. So she's a bit like the melting figure up here, the melting thawing figure. Liquefaction and petrifaction are the two sort of themes of metamorphosis that are invoked here. And we've got this really rich classical background with Niobe, Hyperion, the satyr. Good heavens. Okay, and a little month, that women are associated with. The month, also significant, seems perhaps to indicate the menses, the cycles of female fertility and reproduction. Why even she, oh God, a beast that wants the discourse of reason, would have mourned longer, married with my uncle, my father's brother, but no more like my father than I to Hercules. Hercules, the figure of supreme celestial strength in the classical pantheon. I'm not like my father, this tells us. Claudius isn't like my father, and I'm not like my father either. So who does Claudius resemble? Hamlet resemble? Does he resemble Claudius? So these are questions that this text brings up, and we hear, later that we've learned at the beginning of the play that old Hamlet, was a warrior king who smote the sledded Polacs on the ice, in his battle with the Poles. And he beat Norway, obviously, in individual combat. We learned this. So he's a warrior prince. Whereas we're moving on now to a Renaissance prince, very different kind of energy. Within a month, and yet the salt of most unrighteous tears had left the flushing of her galled eyes and red eyes from she married, O most wicked speed, to post with such dexterity to incestuous sheets. It is not, nor cannot come to good, but break my heart, for I must hold my tongue. Now, I love that last line because it's about self-censorship, it's about repression and the inability to speak one's truth in this particularly repressive situation. But I'm also fascinated by these sheets because it seems to me that the seed, the rank and gross in nature, there is a kind of connection between those two things. We're brought to sort of discuss, and Hamlet's going to be pretty obsessed with those incestuous sheets, even though the ghost has told him not to be, obsessed with his mother, but he disobeys that immediately. The other thing that fascinates me is that line, but break my heart, for I must hold my tongue, fits with Catherine in the Taming of the Shrew, written somewhat earlier. She will speak her mind. Why, sir, I trust I may have leave to speak, and speak I will. I am no child, no babe. Your betters have endured me say my mind, and if you cannot, best you stop your ears. My tongue will tell the anger of my heart, or else my heart concealing it will break, and rather than it shall, I will be free, even to the uttermost, as I please in words. Now, that's very interesting to me because it's one of these connections that's often unnoticed with femininity. Obviously, there is a tradition of having Hamlet in the theatre played by a woman, partly because, as Laurence Olivier said, Hamlet is the tragedy of a man who can't make up his mind. So all that dithering in the 19th century was thought to make Hamlet feminine. And, so that's one kind of tradition, that he's got this feminine sense, but also he, if he's not like his father, as we saw in that first soliloquy, is he like his mother? And we're told, in Act 4, Claudius says the queen, his mother, lives almost by his looks. So there's that sense of connection between, that she uses him as a mirror in some way, of this resemblance between the two. So, and this is a bit in the closet scene, look on this picture and on this, how can you compare these two guys? And then he's worried, this business about the month, the connection with fertility is interesting, because he says, that an old trot like you shouldn't really be interested in this at your age. How you eyes, you cannot call it love, for aught you at your age, the heyday in the blood is tame. It's humble waits upon the judgment, and what judgment would step to this? So, at your age, it shouldn't be. Oh, shame, where is thy blush, rebellious hell, if thou canst mutiny in a matron's bones. So he appears to say, you're beyond childbearing age. Why are you so, have you remarried in this way? So there's a sense that his mother should be kind of desexualized. And then she says she appears to admit some kind of guilt, but it appears to be sexual guilt. She doesn't say, oh, but I helped conspire with Claudius to murder your father because I was having an affair with your uncle. That we do not get. But nor does she say that she wasn't doing that. So, and then we get back to this bed, the incestuous sheets. Incestuous because in this period, if you married a close relative, an uncle, the widow of a brother, that could be seen as incestuous. It's from, I think, the book of Deuteronomy. But Henry VIII in 1509 had done precisely that. He had married his brother Arthur's wife, Catherine of Aragon. But Catherine, when Henry tried to divorce her, brought out the wedding sheets stained with blood. She said, Arthur and I never consummated our marriage. I was a virgin when I married Henry, and here are the sheets 30 years on. So sheets meant a lot to people in the early modern period. They didn't just chuck them out. And also this proof that you were a virgin. So very interesting. Nay, but to live in the rank and sweat of an enseamed bed, stewed in corruption. Again, we've got this world of corruption, like the uncontrolled vegetation that we saw in the first soliloquy. Honeying and making love over the nasty sty. Ooh, now enseamed is interesting. It kind of means soaked with semen. That's one sense of it. And it refers back to this seed that we looked at, that word that came up, you know, seed and gross in the first soliloquy. But enseamed also meant in this period, people were careful with sheets. Not only did the upper classes, the aristocrats, save the wedding sheets as proof of, you know, the honorable taking of virginity, but also if a sheet wore in the middle, as sheets would do, you would cut them down the middle and you would sew a seam up the middle to get more wear out of the sheets. So enseamed can also mean that. You won't find that in the notes of any edition of Hamlet, but it's something I happen to know, one of those things that you pick up. So it could be here too that, you know, that Gertrude is a recycler of sheets, just as she's a fast recycler of husbands. So she, you know, her kind of housewifery extends to this. So that's why I'm fascinated by that word. Again, you know, there's no definitive, you know, you can't just put a, you know, a cap on it, but there are all these wonderful, rich resonances in the language. This is Millet's portrait of the drowning Ophelia. And what I love about this, the most lyrical expression in the play, and it is spoken by Gertrude about Ophelia. We don't have many interactions with them in the play. They're, you know, and you get the sense of, you know, she says at the funeral, I'd like to have strewed thy bride bed, not thy grave. She seems to have had no objection to the marriage, whereas you remember that Polonius was saying, oh, you know, Ophelia, stay away from Hamlet. He is, you know, above thy star. You know, he is someone who's too aristocratic for you. But she seems to have thought that this would have been a viable relationship for them. And this is a magnificent piece. And I think when I think about freedom of speech, Ophelia ascends into song. She ascends into lyricism. And I think that that's, you know, tomorrow is St. Valentine's Day. She is able to speak even of sexual things, but only in song. And, you know, one of the gentlemen who speaks about her death says her speech is nothing, and yet it moves the hearer to recollection. I.e., it doesn't mean anything, but there's something incredibly poignant about it. And I think it's the musicality of language that Shakespeare is addressing there. And while this is Gertrude's elegy on Ophelia, is speech rather than song, it nonetheless evokes the lyricism of poetry, precisely those qualities that it shares with music. But remember, Hamlet is a play that has music in it. Often modern productions don't do justice to the fact that there is, you know, they often have people sort of half saying the stuff, but really in the bad quarto, Ophelia comes on with the lute. She's actually playing. So I'm sure that I'm absolutely convinced that these were songs embedded, not just, you know, some sort of broken mad speech. So this is Gertrude's beautiful, magnificent elegy on Ophelia. There is a willow grows ascant the brook that shows his hoar leaves in the glassy stream. There with fantastic garlands did she make of crowflowers, nettles, daisies and long purples that liberal shepherds give a grosser name. But our cold maids do dead men's fingers call them. There on the pendant boughs her cornet weeds, clamouring to hang an envious sliver broke, when down her weedy trophies and herself fell in the weeping brook. Her clothes spread wide, and mermaid-like awhile they bore her up, which time she chanted snatches of old lords, as one incapable of her own distress, or like a creature native and endued unto that element. but long it could not be, till that her garments heavy with their drink pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay to muddy death. Beautiful lines. Now, I'm just going to take, I think I've got like 5 minutes to just give you a quick whip through this. So the willow, obviously associated with mourning because it weeps into the brook, very reminiscent of Catherine Hamlet's death, only a mile down the river from where in Huntington, where Shakespeare grew up in Stratford-upon-Avon, in the same river. So that shows his hoar leaves, it's rough leaves, but hoar also an homonym with whore. So there's a sense of, again, you know, this outlaw female sexuality that, and Hamlet, of course, later himself, why must I look like a whore, unpack my heart with words? So that sense of transgressive female sexuality invoked even here. So she's got flowers. Again, poesy and poetry were synonyms in the period. And anthologia is the Greek word for a gathering of flowers, and anthology, obviously, for poetry. So there's this connection, this aesthetic connection between these flowers and poetry itself. And these are the flowers: crowflowers, nettles, daisies, and long purples. Long purples are these things that, you know, are rude shepherds, you know, rude people from the countryside give a rude, you know, a grosser name. They seem to resemble male genitalia, but are cold maids, the liberal shepherds, liberal again, free speech, free, you know, they can use these rude words, give this ruder names, but are cold maids, i.e. cold, chaste, or dead, right? The cold maids can mean both things. Obviously, you know, they call them, these chaste young women call them dead men's fingers, as opposed to, you know, the sexual referent that the free-speaking young men. But cold maids somehow connects us with this corpse of Ophelia that's floating in the brook. These vows, they are they're envious. They, you know, and they want to be close to her, and they pull her this wonderful image, and then her clothes spread wide, which is a kind of image of, you know, sexual impropriety as well in death, that there's some sort of freedom there. Remember, Ophelia has been so constrained by her father and her brother, and as well by Hamlet's madness and his apparent sudden change in his affections toward her. And she's like a mermaid, you know, again, a very ambiguous sort of image in the period. She chanted snatches of, she's singing old hymns. Again, the hymns are better than tomorrow's St. Valentine's Day, which is about a woman losing her virginity. But in death, she's singing these old things. She's associated with song, with lyricism, that the only freedom for her, freedom of speech, is in song and in death itself. So she doesn't seem to know that she's distressed, or she's like somebody who belongs to the element of water itself. Interesting, remember that this too solid flesh would thaw and melt, resolve itself into a dew, and Niobe associated with water as well. And now we have this woman in the water drowning. Femininity, dissolution, wateriness, which allies Hamlet more closely with femininity than with the Herculean or Hyperion type qualities of epic male identity. But long it could not be. Pull the poor wretch from her melodious lay, her beautiful song, to muddy death. And that line ends, you know, we get a short line of verse there. The iambic line is cut to give us that sense of finality. I can only touch on so few things today, for which I'm sorry, but I hope I've illuminated a little bit about these passages and a kind of a less commonly explored, I hope, sense of Hamlet's connection with watery femininity. I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Dr. Callahan, thank you so much for this. And I think we do have a few questions. And I'd actually like to pose a question, which is, You are someone who has spent a lifetime studying Shakespeare, studying a play like Hamlet. Can you share with us, even with this lifetime of study, an aha that you had with this text that kind of blew your mind?
Every time you read it, it's a different play. And, one of the things that you were invoking at the beginning is the specific context about vulnerable young people. That suicides have been on the rise during the COVID era, etc. The thing that is blowing my mind right now is, which I kind of, I've known it was there, but I didn't really, pay so much attention to it, is this business about, but break my heart, for I must hold my tongue. That we are thinking about in this society right now, free speech. When do we call something out appropriately as an injustice? And when do we, defame somebody on Twitter? Or when is there fake news? How do we adjudicate between these various kinds of speech? And so the liberal shepherds giving the grocer name, who is allowed to speak, and what are they allowed to say, and what forms of speech are prohibited? And the thing is, every time there's any crisis in the world, really, and also, the business in Hamlet, when do you go to war? When do you take action? What do you do about the, Russia and the Ukraine? These questions, I think it's the phenomenal relevance at any given temporal moment, at any moment in the news cycle. We're just, you read this play and you think, did you actually, know of it? Could he see the future? I do wonder about that at times. I mean, I have come to that point. And again, the business about abusing women, really significant. We have our Me Too moment and so on. But I think of all these possible connections to our current temporal predicament, this business about, what does it mean to be able to speak freely? Why is that important? Who can do it? Are there, and what's libel and what's, and what's appropriate free speech? So for me, and this is just reading it again for this event, I'm thinking, wow, that's incredible. So very very struck with all that at the moment, and it will strike different people. And I remember the year that my father died, and I was teaching this play. It becomes something completely different. I mean, so both personal and world events, political events, always seem incredibly relevant. I think that's true of lots of Shakespeare's plays, but perhaps none more so than Hamlet. How did he do that?
Amazing.
Yeah.
I think Dr. Kamala Schelling has a question. Dr. Kamala Schelling?
I do have a question. Thank you, Dimna. That was wonderful and mind-blowing, as your talks always are. I can't wait to actually go back and watch the video and keep digesting all the things you're saying. And part of what is so incredible about the way you talk about Shakespeare, and also, by the way, everybody, look up her book, Hamlet, Language and Writing, because she does a similar thing in this book. Are all these strands of meaning pull out of any given word, and the way all these meanings are braided together. So I have two questions related to that. One, how much of that do you think audiences were picking up on at the time in the moment? And two, they all just know who Niobe was, or is this something that you add on later as you go back and read it? And second question, because we're teachers here, what has been the most effective or successful way you've found of teaching these texts to students? Do you like to focus in on one little passage? Do you give a broader overview? Because again, they're so rich and dense. So those are my two questions.
Those are great questions. I think to address the second part first, then I'll get you to remind me of the first part. I've probably forgotten mine then. I think I never, they tend to sort of want to focus on the plot. And I want them to know the plot and understand the plot. It's not an easy plot. Nothing happens essentially, except a lot happens. You know, there's a botched killing of Polonius. There's Hamlet decides not to kill Claudius while he's at his prayers. Hamlet's sent to England. There's the business with the pirates. So I do want them to understand those things. And I always say, watch your production. But then I really need to teach people how to read the words themselves. And, you know, the one way of addressing a monumental text like this is to think that Shakespeare had to write it one word at a time, you know, and I love, there's a quote from, I've forgotten who it is now. Is it Mallarmé, I think, that great works are written not with ideas, but with words. And that's very significant. And of course, in the case of this opera, with music as well. So, and again, just thinking about this, the musicality connection really struck me this time too. So I think that is, you know, is a really important thing to do. And the first bit of your question was,
to what extent do you think audiences at the time were picking up on all of these connections? I
think it would depend. You know, everybody who'd been to grammar school would certainly be thinking Hyperion, Niobe, you know, they'd be aware of all that. But don't forget, Shakespeare was always interested, not just in, you know, we're always told the play's the thing, which, you know, it's very important. But Shakespeare was a canny businessman. He was a sharer in his company, and he was always interested in selling texts as well. So people would, you know, that's why we have these editions. People read them, and so people who read them would be looking at something slightly different. So the reading experience is different. It is more intense, and that's why Q1, which is a sort of disaster as a literary text, but it actually works pretty well in the theatre because you have to, you know, you have to cut a lot out. And, you know, audiences, I think one of the reasons why Q1, which I am sure is not authorized by Shakespeare, and we know this for other reasons because Q2 says this is a, you know, true and perfect copy, it's corrected edition, that you know, that performance said, I knew nothing about this. Gertrude says, I knew nothing about this murder. I had no idea your father was murdered, because audiences probably got a bit confused. Whereas Q2 and the folio ask us to be uncertain about things. We're suspended. We're suspended like the ghost who's in purgatory, and we're suspended like Hamlet who can't quite act. We don't quite know. There's an epistemological crisis at the heart of Hamlet too. So I think, you know, again, if you're reading, it's a different matter. Audiences are going to pick up, those who know these references will certainly recognize them. But there's a lot of description of rural life here. And I'm sure that would have resonated with people. Remember, you know, Shakespeare's in London, he's going to miss the countryside in, you know, the banks of Avon. This is sort of what's being described here. So there's something for everybody in this text. But you know, I mean, one of the great questions people always ask is, could people hear iambic pentameter? Could they hear blank verse? And it's actually, do audiences hear it now? You know, it just depends. So we can't really say for certain, but clearly audiences would have been attuned to these very poetic elements, and the better educated would have known the classical references. And then also there's a whole bunch of ordinary people who are going to the theatre as groundlings who've heard about Hyperion and stuff because they've been to so many plays. They've, you know, they've got the picture. So, and this is a new urban theatre audience. So it's not, you know, like when you had your travelling groups of players visiting Stratford or visiting Warwickshire. This is a new, I would say, they've got enough money, or you don't need much to go to the theatre, but they've had the education of Shakespeare's theatre itself and his great contemporaries. So we perhaps shouldn't underestimate them either. I'm sorry that's such a long answer, but it was such a good question.
That's a wonderful answer. And I especially love the thing you said about Shakespeare wanted to keep making money off of these. So he was going to print them and distribute them. So I had never thought about that before. Thank you, Dimna. As always, hearing you speak is such a treat.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Well, I'm going to jump back in here and thank you again, Dr. Callahan. And quickly before you go, do you believe in ghosts and have you ever seen one?
I've never seen one, but I have to say, my father had exactly the same experience as Dan Marshall. Exactly. And my mother was always very skeptical about this, but you know, I believe my father. He said he saw the ghost of his grandmother, who spoke to him, and said, you know, everything will be okay.
There you go.
Who was skeptical. So I think I have to, you know, so grandmothers, I think, are, you know, it's not really fathers who come back as ghosts, it's people's grandmas.
Grandmas are powerful and transcendent. Doctor, thank you again. My brain always feels so much larger after having spent time with you. Thank you so much.
I'm so thrilled to be here, and I enjoy it so much. And I have to say, I am so looking forward to the next part. I'm so excited about this.
Me too. Me too. All right. So you stay here and we'll roll forward. That was wonderful. Again, I'm repeating myself, but I always feel like I've won a contest when I get to spend this time, even in a Zoom room with you amazing friends.